being able to understand that and then take that and say, okay, obviously there's a capability to help sell as well from security. And so I think enabling the business to be able to offer better security around products, not just check the box, what we all expect to go sign into an application.
Welcome to Securing the Future podcast with your hosts, Jesse Metters and Ramin Lamei, where we discuss the latest cutting-edge technologies and how they are affecting the security industry. Join us as we explore the latest advancements and discuss how these innovations are shaping the future of security. With Jesse, a skilled recruiter, and Ramin, a seasoned security leader, this is the show where industry expertise meets in-depth discussions.
All right, we're back for another episode of Securing the Future podcast. Today we are going to be talking about the area of business enablement as a CISO, and actually kind of crossing over into how security leaders can really affect business development for an organization, especially on the government sector when tech is selling to government, which we're seeing more and more growth in. So we've got a special guest, Scott McCormick. Hey, Scott, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Jesse.
And as always, my trusty co-host, Ramin Lamei.
What's up?
All right. Well, we're excited about kicking this off. Scott, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day as a CISO at Planet currently and able to join us and talk about this subject, which it's interesting. Some of the last episodes we've done, there's been a lot of this theme of creating the right experience for an organization, understanding the psychology and how you can really mold security to enable an organization to do better and be more efficient, and how to be a more efficient leader. We had kind of one of our last episodes. And so the area of business enablement and really kind of digging into that, and also walking us through your really interesting background, because you kind of come from a government background, and how that shaped the way you think and the way that you learned how to be an effective leader in security. So I guess we could start. Just love to hear a little of your story, kind of the evolution of the roles you've had into where you are now, and then we can kind of dig in a little bit more into this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Yeah, coming from the military, U.S. Air Force, you end up with seeing what you can do in the military, and then I got out and was a government contractor for multiple years and worked across NSA, CIA, FBI, all in the cyber intel space. And so there's a lot of things in that realm that you just can't do on the outside, right? But at the same time, being the attacker, as we used to say, to be able to attack, you need to be able to defend, how to exploit. And so going down all those different avenues and understanding how to attack and exploit, it gives you a different look on life when you're trying to protect a company as we do today. So and then spent better part of 13, 14 years military and government, and then moved to the consulting world, where working with big banks, insurance, healthcare, financial firms. And so got really just a wide breadth of different industry knowledge. And then moving into the startup world, HackerOne to Reciprocity, now Risk Optics, and then Foursquare as well, a short stint there, and now Planet being a publicly traded company. I will say startups are great. Being a public company as well, you still have your challenges, right? Even though you're no longer in a startup mode. But I will say Planet's definitely a great company. We still have that startup mentality though. So there's challenges and risks across the board no matter where you're at.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's start kind of, how did you take your experience from military? And I'm interested, I bet you some of this is in consulting. And I actually do find that folks that come from some experience in consulting really gain an understanding of business and how important it is to understand the businesses that you're working with, because you're constantly in different industries all the time. But I'm curious, coming out of the military, like, how did you start to understand the business side of security? What was that transition like for you?
Yeah, it was an interesting time coming from the covert world and where you didn't talk about your job at all, to then taking and applying those principles to large organizations, some heavily regulated, some not. So as far as it's really trying to take those basic principles and just flip them over the fence, understand how it affects a business. When I moved into consulting, that was a little over 10 years ago. I had no idea about business enablement and how businesses really operated, because the government's, it's all bureaucracy. So I think having some good mentors in that space was really good to understand why you can and can't do certain things that you can in the business realm that you can or can't do in the government space. So
Scott, it's interesting. You and I have like opposite backgrounds, but we're in similar seasons in our careers, and we both gone the consulting route. I came from the commercial world, as you came from the government and intelligence background, and then I came blue team versus red team, right? So blue team, you're dealing with a lot of data, trying to find the single scenario that you're trying to watch out for, and then adapting, right? Adapting your controls, your defense in depth, your rules. And then we both went the consulting route, where I've been doing this for about a little over a year now. And it's, I think you and I probably have had a different experience through consulting. I think mine's been more eye-opening around like the business side of security, technology companies, SaaS-based companies, understanding more around what are transactions, whether it's a PE firm buying or selling or a company starting up, what are some of the goals, and then how do you wrap security around each of those scenarios, right? They're very different in each of their needs. So it's interesting as you talk about your background and where you are, we do find ourselves in similar space in terms of our experiences. And it's, as you go towards the planet, I'm curious to hear what you've learned through what they do in their business, right? Because you were kind of describing it to us before this call. It seems like a very different security program to adapt there, right? But you're still doing some of the basics, right? You're still applying like the CIA principles, like the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but you have to be closer to the business. You have to understand your use cases a lot more thoroughly, and I'm sure your background in being very technical helps you there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. If I think about it, right, like I did hardware reverse engineering as part of my career and working on satellites in the military and intelligence side of the business. And so now I'm looking, when I go into the lab, like I understand what people are doing from a very technical level. So there's definitely pluses to having that background.
How much do you put in also like on the R&D side? I'm curious, like is security through your organization showing up and saying, all right, what protocols? How are you thinking about the next version of this protocol? Are you showing up there in those scenarios as well?
I've been doing that for years, right? Like quantum computing's coming down the pipe. I worked a little bit on quantum when I was in the government, and we always looked at it as like the encryption killer, right? Like how do we make sure that we're using cryptography that is going to be resistant to quantum down the road? And we're at that stage where we're being able to apply that to hardware, to software. So,
wow. That is really interesting. And the fact that you've also had that ability to be more forward thinking about it and planning for the future, especially with a critical data source like satellite images, right? Like that's critical data that you can't get in the wrong hands. So interesting, because a lot of the stuff I'm doing now on the search side of the business that I work in outside of Tech Compass is definitely military tech. I'm seeing this huge move to technology companies that now need to be able to sell to DoD or government, and the level of trust that needs to be built there. What are some of the things that you've been able to learn coming from military now into startup, going into the startup sector? Some of the companies you worked with before did sell to the government, and now coming into an organization where like trust is everything, right? And understanding how to communicate risk as well to the stakeholders involved. How have you found that to be really important for you as the CISO from a driving the business perspective?
Yeah, I mean, dealing with governments or even the U.S. government, right? Like they have FedRAMP and now CMMC's coming down the pipe, right? Like there's compliance requirements around it. But then you also have countries that will come to you and say, hey, we need a VPN for this, or we want some sort of security, special security for that. And so being able to understand that and then take that and say, okay, obviously there's a capability to help sell as well from security. And so I think enabling the business to be able to offer better security around products, not just check the box, what we all expect to go sign into an application. So I think there's huge opportunities to really, as I was saying earlier, is like shift from that whole security shop of no's to being, hey, how can we help enable the business? How can we help sell? How can we help really turn that loss or operational expenditure of security into really something that can be monetized? So I think there's, whether it's from a SaaS company or whether it's from a company like Planet where we're selling data, there's definitely capabilities there. One of the fun ones that I always go up against is a lot of our SaaS vendors are like, oh, if you want SSO with MFA, it's extra dollars for that, right? And it's like, that should just be fundamental security baked into a product. But when we start talking about being able to offer additional security beyond, whether it's better encryption or single tenant versus multi-tenant, things like that, there's a lot of capabilities there that I think security can help take to the market. So.
What's interesting is you talk about like business enablement, right? I think that's regardless of industry or company, that's the difference between I would say, a new modern approach to a CISO versus the legacy where they're very technical, must follow this framework to a T, not understanding their business, not adapting, right? So I think one of the key things you've already highlighted that we've had kind of as a recurring theme on a number of these conversations, the way you show up, the way you enter a room. And a CISO these days is no longer just a subject matter expert, as we kind of talked about offline. Love to hear from you. What are all the different roles you have to wear, right, depending on who you're interacting with, and what does it take to do that?
Yeah, well, and you bring up a good point, right? Which is on the military and defense side, right? When you're building a system, right? It's NIST 853 by the book. Everything has to be signed off with, right? There's no room for compromise, right? And so as we look at security today, as a modern leader in security, we've got to be saying, hey, how do we come to a compromise, right? What's the risk threshold we're willing to accept when we make decisions, right? So it's no longer the shop and nose. It's how do we enable a function to happen, right? And sometimes you are taking risks. Sometimes you say, okay, there's going to be this risk. You can never burn risk to zero, right? So I think we've got to get beyond the hard frameworks of thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, right? There's definitely room to be between the lines there, so.
One example that pops up that I've seen in the consulting world, and I think I've brought this up before on here, is I once took on an interim role to be a security leader for a company that hadn't had a security program before. And this company had been around 20 years. They're in the SaaS space providing a kind of like a security compliance type product. I won't give them any more details than that, but within like 5 minutes of talking to the leadership, it became very apparent that security wasn't the problem. It was like a byproduct problem. As soon as they started kind of talking about like doing application releases and kind of those things, it was very clear that they had no risk management in their language, right? So they're making decisions short-term versus long-term, but no one's writing things down. No one's weighing in on, is this decision the right decision for us? And very quickly I learned the amount of tech that they had, right? And the management challenges that they had. And the challenge for me then became not building a security program and just stuffing it in there, but it was helping them understand that they need to do a better job of managing risk. And it all starts with that language and adapting that language at the executive level, and then writing stuff down and having a risk registry and the basic process just to manage risk.
Yeah. And I always say, like, I run a risk-based security practice, right? I've done that it's kind of what I learned to do in the consulting world, right? You've got to do the gap analysis, you've got to do the risk analysis, and then start figuring out what your roadmap's going to look like. And so as we think about like frameworks are great. Like, we're ISO certified, right? I've been through FedRAMP before, like all of that. And those are great to say, okay, here's a framework we're going to use. But at the same time, like, you've got to understand your risks and that threshold to be able to make a plan forward.
More than understanding risk, you have to then communicate.
Yeah. Being able to talk to your board effectively, right? Like, that's key. I can tell you, I think it's definitely an art. It's also understanding your board, right? Like, first time I meet with a board when I come onto a company, right? Like, obviously introduce yourself, you're new, start talking to them, try to understand what their concerns are. Usually it's finger in the wind. We just want to make sure everything's secure. And it's like, well, let's unpack that a little bit and understand what your needs are when it comes to me figuring out how to communicate to you. So, and then also just the executive team too. I mean, I've been with so many different executive teams over the years that some understand it, some don't, right? And so how do you effectively communicate to, per se, a team that they just think of security as something that is a negative on the balance sheet? So.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what are you seeing in your experience with the different parts of the organization that typically are either pushing back on security and don't understand it and see it as truly just a cost center, versus the departments that seem to embrace and understand it a little bit more when you properly explain it? I think that's huge. And a lot of the security leaders I meet, after conversations with them, I'm like, yeah, you're complaining about everybody not getting it, but I think you're just not communicating it well. So there is definitely a huge burden of the responsibility on the CISO to be able to communicate it well in a language that all the different stakeholders can understand, right? Like we were just talking about that. You communicate to the board, you talk about money. Like, what is this actually going to cost if the risk is actualized, and be able to communicate that to those different teams. But yeah, I'm curious though, like because there's definitely still pushback that happens in organizations that don't get it yet. And then, of course, leaders that don't communicate it well. But what are you seeing with those specifically, like stakeholders in generally speaking, right? We're not going to talk about your current organization, of course, but what do you see as maybe the more challenging departments to convince?
Yeah, I think it depends on, it's not necessarily departments, it's really the roles in which, like if you have a CFO that doesn't understand security, like figure out how to communicate effectively to them to make them understand it. I think you've got to start with the baseline and you've got to build that trust, right? So I think there's a couple of different avenues. If I've come into an organization and found pushback, it's usually because somebody doesn't understand it. And it's typically the old, because security said no, or because security said so, or compliance said so. And it's like, well, obviously nobody's done the explaining to you as to the why, right? Like, so I think there's a lot of education. And I tell my teams all the time, right? Like, you've got to be able to educate your stakeholders, right? Not just give them a decision. So I think that's where it really starts. And honestly, like the last few organizations I've been in, yeah, there's been some people that have pushed back, but ultimately by education, they've come around and they understand it. At least you might not get budget for stuff, but at the same time, like as long as you can report, here's the risks that we're taking, here's the dollars and cents that it equates to. If, like you said, like if something happens, then ultimately you're there as an advisor to the board and to the executive team. You're not necessarily, you may or may not be the decision maker when it comes to being able to get budget and stuff. So,
and I think that's really key what you just said, right? You're not a risk owner, you're an advisor to the business, right? So you have to figure out who owns these risks, right? And you have to assign ownership to the risk, and then you have to communicate, right? Over communicate, and then give options.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, here's option 1, 2, and 3, right? Like, let's again come to a compromise and figure out what makes sense.
Yeah, no, great point. Great points. Love to hear some of the things that you're seeing in the challenges, I guess, within a company that is working closely with maybe government agencies or entities when it comes to some of the interesting threats that you see. If there's anything you can talk about there, that would be kind of fascinating. I know you're working with satellites, and there's the threat landscape is so broad with what you guys do. Just the tech nerd in me is definitely curious. Whatever you can talk about. Obviously, I know there's things you can't talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same in any hardware manufacturing company, right? It's supply chain risk, right? Like, where are our chips coming from? Who's making our boards? Things like that. To software as a service, right? Like, using open source libraries. Is there, dear God, another Log4j pops up, right? Like, how do you prepare for stuff like that, and how do you maintain the trust with your vendors and suppliers and all of that, right? So I think there's a huge opportunity there for a very large battlefield. I'll put it that way.
How does Scott? How does evolving like technology impact you guys? Like, does technology evolve, whether it's quantum or AI? Like, how quickly are those being adopted, and how quickly are you doing your research to figure out what can I put out there, right? Because you have the physical challenges of what you do, right? If you put a satellite in space, that costs money, that costs time. You can't just bring that back down if tomorrow you figure out I didn't put the right hardware. Or how does that factor in with evolving technology for you guys?
Yeah, NVIDIA's launched AI chips and stuff like that, right? GPUs have become a normal presence in hardware. There's a lot of capabilities there that we're constantly looking at. And then just from a security perspective over the time, right? Like we were talking about earlier, quantum cryptography, right? Like resistant encryption, right? Like how do we, upgrade capabilities, whether it's in software, whether it's in hardware, things like that. Like you said, like you put a satellite in space, guess what? It's there, right? It's got to deorbit and come back down. You can't just go fix it. So, but at the same time, we launch satellites on the regular. It's what we call agile space.
Space, yeah.
If you think about it, NASA takes 10, 15 years to launch a satellite. We do it in 12 to 18 months on the regular. So,
wow.
So then you also work with other parties to get your equipment out there then, right?
Yep. Yeah. So SpaceX launches all of our satellites currently. Talk about a feat of engineering, looking at what they've done when it comes to rockets and stuff like that. It's amazing to see that technology evolve and come to market. So,
yeah. What are some of the biggest things that are keeping you up at night Scott, when it comes to security?
I think ultimately, I think about coming from my background, right? State actors, things like that. Regardless, if they want in, they're going to get in, right? You can't defend against a state actor. They've got unlimited budgets and they'll figure out a way in that most people would have never thought about, right? So whether that's through software or that's through hardware, there's all sorts of different capabilities that I've done in my career that back when I was in the defense and intelligence side that I still shake my head at and go, nobody would ever know that that attack is even taking place. So I think those not necessarily keep me up at night, but it's stuff that's always on the back of my mind going, okay, how would I think about this if I was a state actor trying to attack infrastructure that I'm responsible for? So,
Scott, what would you say is your superpower as a CISO? It's a question I like asking, whether it's in person or virtual, because I think it gives us a little bit more insight into people and how they think, how they operate. What would you say is your superpower?
Oh, that's a good one. I think what comes to mind, and we've kind of touched upon it, is being able to take technical and put it to policymakers. I've done that for most of my career, even back in the intelligence days, was being able to take something super technical and explain it, which again goes to educating your executive team, your board, all of that. And then also just like when it comes down to your people, trusting your people and educating them, giving them advancement opportunities. I think those are things that I'm always thinking about when it comes to just day-to-day stuff.
So communicating and being a good leader, right? So that's the more modern approach that we see. Not being a subject matter expert, right? Trusting your people, like you said, empowering your people.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for people that want to be CISOs? I'm curious.
Don't stay in a job for too long, right? Like if I think about like my military career, I was moving positions, jobs from different offices and stuff like that around everywhere from sometimes I was there for 6 months, sometimes I was there for a year and a half. So being able to go learn and be a sponge and soak up different areas of the landscape, I think that's really key, is to understand the different things, right? Like I've done computer forensics, I've done hardware reverse engineering, just stuff that like probably most people don't think of when you think of cybersecurity, right? But they're components of cybersecurity, right? They're super technical, but at some point, if you want to be a CISO, you've also got to come up and boil yourself off of fingers on keyboard and get into understanding how business works and understanding how your CFO thinks and your board thinks. So there's all those capabilities.
What are some things that you think the up-and-coming leaders can do to enhance or grow in those skills? Obviously, you mentioned getting experiences in different types of organizations, but even outside of work, what are some things that maybe you have done to develop yourself?
Yeah, I think there's, again, like you talk to a CISO, right? Or a bunch of CISOs, we all have different ways we've come into the job. And so I think it's really kind of understanding across, talk to CISOs and understand like what they've been through. I can tell you, my friends and colleagues like to, when we go grab beers or whatever, they're like, hey, tell us about, how you came into this job. And so I think telling those fun war stories, they may not have been fun in the moment, but looking back on them, it's how you build character in the job. It's how you learn. And obviously we all do after actions and lessons learned. So I think there's a lot of just really, I would say networking, right? Like network across CISOs, understand how they think, what the different verticals they're in, right? Somebody in healthcare or pharma is very different than somebody in the tech SaaS world, right? So highly regulated versus non-regulated industries too. So
yeah, no, I think building community and building a network within those that you want to be like eventually is really important. It sounds like you also said earlier in the conversation that you had a great mentor that helped you as you kind of moved into consulting, or a couple of mentors, if you will, not just probably one. But I agree. And I also think if you have the opportunity, work under a great CISO. Like try to find an organization where hey, that CISO is rock solid and I can learn from that person and be able to kind of take what that person did and how they built their program and then learn from that. And then when you get into your next organization, as you're ready to start stepping into a leadership role, you've now learned what looks good, right? Or you may learn from somebody who failed and you learn what does not look good, right? What does not work. We learn a lot from failure too. I was just talking to another CISO about this recently. He said, I learned the most from being part of failures and failing myself. And so we definitely know that's important. Don't be afraid to try something and then take responsibility and learn from it and improve.
Yeah. Yeah. And learn from others' failures so you don't have to go through the same pain, right?
Exactly. Because it can be pretty detrimental when you fail as a security leader. Yeah. No, this is great, Scott. Well, we really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us and share some of your story and some of the things that you've learned. And I do hope that in the next 10 years, we see almost across the board, the CISO position is folks like yourself that think the way you do, right? About really being an enabler to the business. And hopefully this position continues to evolve and is seen properly from the board's perspective as this is a critical role to our business succeeding and growing. I think it's obvious that security is so critical more than ever before because of all of the major attacks that we're seeing hit. As we've digitized everything, we're more vulnerable to attack. And so being able to think that way is critical for our success as a country and, as businesses grow. So this is fantastic. Any last parting words for those that would love to be in the position you are today that you'd like to share, words of wisdom?
Just remember, you always have a target on your front, back, and everywhere in between, right? Like in this job. So you've got to be able to, as we were talking about earlier, right? Like when stuff happens, you got to be calm and cool and collected and understand how to think in those situations versus you don't want somebody running around like a chicken with their head cut off, right? So yeah, hair on fire. So, but yeah, no, thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Scott.
All right. Have a great rest of your week.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Securing the Future podcast with your hosts, Jesse Metters and Ramin Lamei. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a rating.